Welcome to the podcast on North American literature hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada.
Hello, everyone. I'm Saud Krabitson, the host of this podcast. Today, we have with us a special guest, a third-year English studies student and budding researcher, Africa Saith. She will be sharing insights from her fascinating study on the similarities and potential inspirations between Anne Bradstreet's poem Verses Upon the Burning of Our House and Chuck Palahniuk's well-known novel Fight Club. Welcome, Africa, and thank you for joining us. Now, before we start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Why exactly English studies? What led you to choose this particular field?
Well, hello, Savlot. Thank you so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here. To be honest with you, I truly chose this degree because I am really passionate about reading. And when I was in high school, I fell in love with English, the language, and I just really wanted to pursue a degree that I would love studying, in which I could read and study literature, speak English, and all these things that I truly loved. Um, so yeah, here we are today.
Excellent, thank you. It's a rare find these days, if I'm being honest. It's not exactly the most expansive of fields exactly. There aren't too many things that people think to themselves you could research and study, but yet here we are. Like just like me, we're both in the same boat. So very happy that you're joining us. And to begin, would you like to provide a brief summary or some context for these texts? That way, listeners who might not be familiar with them can follow along a bit easier.
Of course, I'd be glad to. Anne Bradstreet's poem, Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, was published in 1666. Bradstreet was one of the first settlers in America, actually, and her poetry often reflects her experiences in this new, unfamiliar land. In this particular poem, she recounts the night her house was destroyed by fire. She expresses the pain of losing her home and her possessions, but she also speaks about how she finds solace in her faith, viewing the fire as part of God's divine plan. It is a deeply reflective piece that illustrates her Puritan beliefs.
That's some may say it's slightly dramatic. Of course, it's a very traumatizing event when it comes to the house, the fire, and all of that. But is that really something that is consistently viewed from your work? The whole part of God's divine plan across the board, or is that exclusive to this poem in particular?
She wrote a lot about stuff regarding God because she was a Puritan, and that was very important for her. Her whole life was kind of devoted to it. That's what Puritans do. You have to be devoted, hardworking every single day, so that your faith can be proven to God. But other poems of hers just talk. They were kind of sermons for their children with her husband. Stuff that she wanted them to know. She has poems missing her husband, just talking about that, how hard life is, starting all over again in a new country that's never been explored. It's really, even in the same path, in the same theme, it's lots of different things that she says.
Yeah, truly a hard time, and that must have been one of the core reasons why such a writer was created. And now back to what you were saying. What about Fight Club?
Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club was published in 1996, a whole 330 years later.
That's quite the gap between the two.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why it's so fascinating to me. This all these similarities that I was able to find. Um, Even though Fight Club is more widely known due to the film adaptation, the novel itself, they have the same story but is slightly different. The novel tells the story of an unnamed protagonist living in a dull, consumer-driven life. When his apartment explodes, he seeks refuge with Tyler Durden, a charismatic man he recently met on a flight. Tyler's rebellious and carefree philosophy transforms the narrator's worldview, and together they establish the infamous Fight Club. Over time, the the underground club evolves into a large scale movement with Tyler at the helm. However, by the end of the novel, it's revealed that Tyler's not actually real. He's a manifestation of the narrator's split personality.
Apologies for the spoilers, everyone, by the way. But as I understand, it's crucial for understanding your research. Is that right?
Definitely, there's one of the most important pieces of my research is at the end of the novel, where we'll talk about it later. But yes, it is very important for me.
Excellent. Very much looking forward to it already. But that's a fantastic introduction, Africa, and thank you. So let's dive into your study. What led you to choose this intriguing topic, and how did you begin noticing these connections?
Well, it all started when I studied Bradstreet's poem in class, and shortly afterward, I read Fight Club for the first time, which I found absolutely riveting, by the way. As I read, I began noticing parallels between the two works. One connection that struck me immediately was the idea of election, a central concept of Puritan theology that I'd studied in my North American literature course. And the thing is, actually, once you take literature classes, they really influence how you read everything. I couldn't stop thinking about how the narrator of Fight Club seemed to embody this idea of being an elected, though not in the religious sense, obviously. But that was the spark for my research.
That's such an interesting story, Africa. And could you explain what you mean by the Puritan? By the way, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, yes, Puritan.
Thank you. What exactly do you mean by the Puritan concept of election? For those unfamiliar with it.
Well, Puritanism was a religious reform movement which, with strict beliefs, centered on hard work, self control, and the rejection of worldly pleasures. One of their key ideas was that God tested people's faith through hardships, as like I said earlier. If someone remained strong in their faith despite adversity, they were considered part of God's elect, a chosen few who were predestined for salvation. Really big thing. Bradstreet's poem is a great example of this, because despite her grief over losing her home, she interprets the fire as a divine test, ultimately reassuring herself that she is one of these people elected. Although Fight Club exists in a very, very incredibly vastly different historical context, I saw the similarities of this belief in the novel, not explicitly but subtly woven into its themes.
That's fascinating. Now let's get into the similarities. What specific parallels did you identify between these two seemingly unrelated works?
Well, the most striking similarity to me is that both texts use the destruction of a home as a catalyst for change. In Bradstreet's poem, for example, the fire forces her to confront the impermanence of earthly possessions and strengthens her faith. Um, whilst for the narration of Fight Club, the explosion of his apartment propels him into a new, chaotic life where he feels alive and in control for the first time.
It's very interesting, and if you think about it, the fire, and we're coming back to it, it's really a tale as old as times. Fire being one of the core drivers of our progress as humans, and then the very old story of Phoenix, where the rebirth and the accompany that's being accompanied by the fire. So quite the interesting similarity that you started with. Uh, what else?
Well, another similarity lies in the very smart observation, by the way. Another similarity lies in the concept of liberation. In Fight Club, there's a line that says, "The liberator who destroys my property is fighting to save my spirit." This mirrors Bradstreet's belief that the fire, while painful, was a divine act meant to strengthen her spiritual connection. Both texts frame loss as an opportunity for personal growth and transformation.
That's Yeah, I have to say that's a really compelling perspective. What other themes or ideas did you find in common?
Both texts also make reference to heaven. Bradstreet speaks of a house on high erect framed by that mighty architect, meaning the eternal home God has prepared for her in heaven. Whilst in Fight Club, it's implied that the narrator yearns for some kind of peace or transcendence, I would say, which he equates with heaven. He even says, I can sleep in heaven, which is at the end of the novel. This is why it was important, suggesting a desire to escape his earthly troubles. Though the religious connotations differ, the idea of seeking a higher plane of existence ties the two works together for me.
You've given us, me definitely, so much to think about already. But you mentioned that your study doesn't stop at thematic analysis. You also looked at stylistic features. Is that correct?
That is absolutely right. Both works share a straightforward, simple style. Bradstreet's poem is written in plain language, which was partly a result of her Puritan beliefs. Ornamentation and excess were discouraged. She also wanted her work to be accessible to readers of all levels of education. Um,
What do you mean by that exactly? What's that about?
well, in Bradstreet's time, there was really not that much opportunity for education, especially for women. You know, but she was very lucky. Her dad had a very good position. He had a very good job in the new colony, and she had the chance to have a great education. She started writing poems to satisfy her dad, and then she just started writing them because she loved to. And I think the simple writing was, in order to find a great audience of the greater as possible, even though education was scarce, for people to be able to read what she was writing.
To apply this, to give a bit more context to our listeners, what exactly was the situation with the education? How bad was it? When it's pointed out as one of the core points, really, that she's trying to go for the broader education through the usage of simpler words, verbiage, if you may. Um, was it really that bad back then in 1666?
Well, I can't really, put my hand on fire to it because I was not there indeed. But I am pretty sure it was quite bad. There was just no desire to make people literate. However, in the colonies and for people such like for Puritans specifically, since their religion is different to others, and the Bible was not meant to be read in one singular way. They were meant to read it, and whatever they took from it, however they interpret it, that is the way it's supposed to be interpreted. So they were supposed to be able to read in order to read the Bible so that they could get this spiritual connection. So actually, Puritans were one of the most literated group. Is that a word? Is literated a word?
I don't believe so, but I think me and the listeners will get the point across of that. So yeah, thank you very much for the context. It's really putting the whole discussion into perspective. I think because especially with um, deeper research, you always have to remember the broader scale of it, right? What it means in terms of the context when you not don't necessarily view this issue or this research in isolation, but you also apply it in the context of history, in the context of what it meant at the time, and how exactly it applies to both of these pieces. Now, as for the Fight Club,
Fight Club, while from a completely different era, also uses concise, direct language. The sentences are short yet impactful, delivering intense moments of revelation without the need of really elaborated sentences. The simplicity makes the novel feel raw and immediate, drawing readers into the protagonist's mind, which is really kind of important in Fight Club since, the mind of the narrator is actually what's creating the whole novel without us knowing.
right? It's quite fragmented, and it's there's a lot of dissociation happening with his insomnia and all, right? But uh, right, I get that. But do you think that Polnick's choice of simple language serves a similar purpose to Bradstreet's, or are the reasons different? Maybe these two are different questions, but if you can, I'm hoping you get what I mean by that. So, can you give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think their reasons are completely different. For Bradstreet, simplicity was both stylistic and practical choice, reflecting Puritan values and ensuring her work could reach a broad audience. And also, since what I mean by Puritan values is that since enjoying things was viewed as a wrong practice, not even their sermons were anything enjoyable because they just didn't want to, because that's wrong. So her poems are not meant to be enjoyed, they're just meant to be read. For Polnick's, actually, the simplicity and enhances the novel's emotional impact and keeps readers focused on the story's core themes. And it's also a tool for maintaining the novel's mystery, I think. The big twist about Tyler Durden is nearly impossible to predict because the writing is so efficient and focused on key details. In a way, it's the simplicity, I think, heightens the suspense.
I see. Yeah, definitely slightly different approaches. But in general, overall, that's an excellent observation. Were there any other stylistic similarities you identified?
Well, yes, actually, both works blend the mundane with the profound. Bradstreet contrasts her everyday experience of losing her home with deep reflections on faith and eternity. Similarly, Polnick juxtaposes the narrator's mundane, consumer driven life with his existential realizations about identity and freedom. This contrast makes both texts resonate on multiple levels, I believe.
That is such a rich analysis. Now, before we wrap up, I want to revisit the symbolism of fire. Do you think the use of fire in both texts is purely coincidental, or does it hold deeper meaning?
Actually, I do believe fire is deeply symbolic in both works. It is a destructive force that leaves nothing behind, emphasizing the permanence of loss and the impossibility of returning to the past. Nothing screams a new beginning like that when there's absolutely no chance of you going back to what it was.
Quite, quite.
Yeah. At the same time, though, fire is a purifying force representing renewal and transformation. And for both Bradstreet and the narrator in Fight Club, the destruction of their homes marks the start of a new chapter in their lives. Very big chapters, if you ask me. Since Bradstreet had to start all over again her life, which had already been started over in a whole new continent, a whole new country that had not been explored. She was one of the first there, and now she has to start all over again. It's absolutely
Right, right. And for the Fight Club, the protagonist really he is committed fully to his life back then. He was pretty proud of his position, being the smart guy who does the calculations, who assesses the risks, and now it's a completely different shift. After the entire apartment thing goes down.
yet. However, you're very right, but I really think the way he was living, the way his work and his boring life was, causing him to have this insomnia that he cannot even tell when he's awake or when he is asleep. I think it really had a big mental toll on him, and also the fact of the moral questioning of his work, of his job, since it was in his hands to say if people would die or live because of the if because of money he would say that a car is safe to use when it's really not. That has to be really heavy on your shoulders, and I think that's what really made him so crazy, actually.
So heavy that you come up with Brad Pitt as the Tyler Durden. Yeah, quite. Well, beautifully said. So, is there anything that you'd like to add before we conclude?
Not really. I think the very important keys, details of my research have already been discussed. I just really hope that this discussion inspires listeners to explore both texts, They're really rich with meaning, and there's so much to uncover if you look closely. Also, again, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure sharing my research with you.
Right. Thank you, Africa. I think it's frankly inevitable because I've already. I'm having some thoughts in my head about the things that you said because your insights have been absolutely fascinating. And this has been a truly engaging conversation, even discussion, I would say. And I'm sure that our listeners will be just as intrigued as I am as what's to come because you will be coming back to us, won't you?
Hopefully, yes, I will.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And have a wonderful evening, both to you, Africa, and our listeners.
Thank you so much, Sabulat. You too, and thank you again.
This podcast was created for the North American Literature course, and we give teacher Miriam our consent to upload it online for research purposes. Thank you all for listening, and until next time.